It has been said that in Twilight Struggle, you need to know the cards well in order to play well. Well, we're going to take you through every card one by one, and we're going to help you become a master at Twilight Struggle. This is Legendary Tactics. The European scoring card is the scoring card that both sides pay the most attention to. There are 5 battlegrounds and 21 countries in Europe. It's going to be very hard fought because if you can control Europe, which means you have control of all the battlegrounds and the most countries overall, you can win the game with an automatic victory. And that's going to mean that people are going to be on the lookout for that, and they're going to try and mitigate that as best as possible. We're going to teach you some things about the European region and the scoring card and how best to use it. One of the interesting things about the Europe region is that even though it's the highest value region, it's actually typically not scored for many points. It's usually divided fairly evenly throughout most of the game. In fact, Europe tends to stay very static throughout the game because it can only allow coups and realignments at DEFCON 5, which is usually a very short-term situation, but also the stability values are very high compared to other regions. A big carrot that's dangled in front of a lot of Twilight Struggle players is to get Europe control, where you would control every one of the battlegrounds and more countries overall. In reality, even at high-level play, a win by Europe control is very rare. One analysis found that only 2.2% of the victories in Twilight Struggle were as a result of Europe control, and that was at high-level play. In fact, every one of those was achieved by the USSR. In fact, one of the pieces of advice out there is that if you see a player going for Europe control, because of the high op investment required to actually achieve it, in many cases you're actually better off taking that opportunity to expand in other parts of the world and probably win by victory points before Europe is even scored. If you're down and look like you might be out, it might not be a bad idea to try for Europe control. It could be a way that you could actually pull a win out of a certain loss. It is a very high-risk strategy, but certainly worth a try and likely very fun. At the beginning of the game, each side gets some ops to start in Europe, and I'm going to show you some of the standard setups. This is a standard USSR setup, and there's not usually much reason to change much from this standard. East Germany receives 1 more influence, and Poland gets 4. Yugoslavia gets 1. That's to grant access to Italy and Greece, and that gives you some options as far as getting into those more affordable Mediterranean countries when you're vying for European domination, if not control. The standard US setup has 4 influence going into West Germany and 3 influence into Italy. The extra influence in Italy is important because Italy is vulnerable to a first turn action round 1 coup, which could change the face of Europe pretty quickly, so you're doing what you can to mitigate that. Especially in games now where the US typically has 1 or 2 extra influence to place as part of either a bid for sides or just agreed upon by the players. Iran may not be the juicy coup target that it usually is in a standard game. Another possible setup is something called the Comic-Con trap, and that's if the USSR finds they've got Comic-Con in their opening hand, they can set the ops up like this, and what this allows them to do is they headline Comic-Con, which allows them to boost the influence in Austria and Yugoslavia. They would get a couple more influence in Eastern Europe. I'm just keeping it simple for the illustration. But then this would allow them to actually do realignments against West Germany and Italy with a +1 modifier. The end result, or the goal is, at least, is to remove US influence entirely from those countries. And because the United Kingdom is far away, it's going to take a couple of turns before they can actually get back into West Germany and Italy, and that's assuming they have the ops to contest it. So it certainly can make for a very interesting option, especially if it works out for the USSR. Some players may ask, why the 4 influence in Austria? And that's because a savvy American player that's familiar with this gambit might take one of the influence and put it in Austria, and that would negate the +1 modifier, would instead make it 0. The extra op there can be boosted by Comic-Con to regain control of Austria and to make the ploy work. A great opening move against a standard US setup is to headline socialist governments. This allows you to take down Italy's influence by 1 or 2, and thereby increasing your odds greatly in an action round 1 coup. Also, you can reduce the influence in West Germany, make that potentially a trouble spot that the United States is going to have to defend, or even reduce the UK by 1, which is a very key territory for the United States, and force them to repair that damage. No discussion of the European region would be complete without discussing the card Blockade. Now, Blockade is a very powerful card in the hands of the USSR. The US player has to keep a 3 op or more card in his hand as long as this card is out there. The consequences of forgetting or misplaying or being forced to lose all influence in West Germany can be very, very significant, and can certainly potentially lead to the USSR controlling Europe and going for the auto win. Realistically, the goal in Europe is domination. It's not control. It's such a long shot to get control that it's really not something that you can consider unless the cards really fall your way. But domination is certainly possible, and the key to this is going to be France and the Mediterranean countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey along the bottom of the region. Now, a lot of US players will not play into France early because of these 2 cards especially. The Suez Crisis just removes US influence, so if the US has 1 or 2 influence in France, it can be completely wiped out of there. De Gaulle leads France, removes US influence, but more importantly adds a USSR influence. And that is really the way that the USSR can get into France and begin contesting that battleground. The other options are basically to either move through West Germany or Italy, which does take extra ops to do so. Another possible route into France for USSR is via Algeria, and that's if the decolonization card has been played and they've placed an influence in Algeria, then they can move into France from there. It's not necessarily a bad idea to play some influence into France in the early war, despite the existence of cards like the Suez Crisis and de Gaulle. And the reason is that those cards may have already gone past, they may have been used for ops by the USSR, or you may have spaced one or both of those cards. And having control of France can score you some points when the European scoring card comes up. If you over-control France, it can also mitigate a lot of those negative effects of those events. A key defensive card for the US player is the Marshall Plan. Not only will this allow the US player to get a head start in controlling the Mediterranean non-battlegrounds that are key to staving off control or domination from the USSR, such as Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey. They are very low stability countries, but they're also very cheap to gain control in. The Marshall Plan also allows the US player to shore up allies like the UK, which are vulnerable to events like the Suez Crisis, or it can even help gain control of Canada, which will allow the NORAD event to come into play if you're playing with that optional card. Now, one of the questions is, what about headlining the European scoring card in the first turn? Well, for the USSR, sure, it doesn't really matter. It may free up an action round for later, and it doesn't really have any negative effects. And especially with defectors out there, it may actually, be a waste of that card. For the US, it is a little bit more risky because of a card like socialist governments. If the USSR happens to headline socialist governments, it can certainly swing Europe towards the USSR and give them some victory points they didn't otherwise deserve. In the mid-war, Europe's going to be pretty static overall. What you might see is an ops war for France, where if the Truman Doctrine card has been and gone, you might see each side bidding up, pouring influence into France in order to try and take control. What you might also see is Italy is a vulnerable target to brush war. So the controlling player is going to want to shore up the neighbors of Italy in order to minimize the effect of a brush war, and hopefully the opposing player will just simply choose a different target with better odds. John Paul II, elected Pope, is a great card to set up the late war for the US. It can be used preferably in the last action round for the event in the last turn of the mid-war, or if you can carry it over until you know you've got some good cards in the late war in hand, then that would be really the best use of it, because it pairs with a lot of cards like Solidarity very well. A nifty move that can be done by the American player in the mid-war is to play salt negotiations on the last action round of a turn, and to use that event to reduce DEFCON by 2 and take the ABM treaty card back. That card can then be headlined on the following turn, and because of the DEFCON drop that happens every turn, you can take the board situation from DEFCON 2 to DEFCON 5, and then you can hit Europe with either a coup or some realignment rolls with 4 ops. The late war is when Europe begins to swing back towards the US, and the reason for that is mainly these 4 events. You've got Solidarity, Tear Down This Wall, Chernobyl, and East European Unrest. And these cards allow the US to start breaking down what the USSR has built in Eastern Europe. Now, the USSR has cards like the Reformer to help defend against this sort of thing, but basically the tide is beginning to turn against the USSR, and it's going to be very hard for them to hold their position unless they were extremely dominant leading up to this point. Interestingly, a card from the early war can have the biggest impact in the late war. If the Warsaw Pact card has not left the game, then it becomes much more powerful for the USSR in the late war. And that's because it can basically undo all the work that the US player has done to get into Eastern Europe. And it can either wipe it out by removing US influence or by adding USSR influence. So this is a card where one might not think of it being a late war card, but in fact it can be played to a huge benefit at that time. Another consideration that you might not have thought of is shoring up Czechoslovakia. It doesn't seem like a very important territory when you are normally playing, but one of the advantages that it has in the late war is that it can be a great reinforcement against alignment rolls in neighboring countries where it has connections. And so it can be a nice little buffer to prevent the US realigning influence out of East Germany and Poland, and perhaps even another neighboring territory. This has been an analysis of the European scoring card, how to use it, when to use it, and a little bit about the region and how it develops over the course of the game. Hope you found it useful. This is NATO with Legendary Tactics. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and look forward to seeing you next time.